not so much like The Wire because it was a niche hit drama, but a major drama that hits around the world, or a format like The X Factor. I encountered Simon Fuller, one of the people behind The X Factor, the other day. They're suggesting it's worth $1 billion a year now. The value of successful, loud things is much greater than it ever has been because they're more global, they're more instantaneous, they spread across more platforms, you can get money out of them in other ways. Loudness, if anything, is more important than ever. But the problem is, it turns out that a lot of the stuff we thought was important just turns out to have been loud. There's no real scarcity in programs to fill the gap between midday and 3 p.m. Go and look at the schedule of ITV or Channel 4, and then look at the schedule of the same channels in the 1970s. Some of the same programs are showing up in those dead, quiet gaps. Doesn't mean you can't make loud, wonderful things for those spaces, but maybe they're not valuable enough, maybe they're not turning up enough cash. Maybe quite a lot of the problem with television is there's too much of it, rather than that it's not good enough. But that's a difficult thing to say to somebody from television. It's also a difficult thing to say to somebody from newspapers, particularly from the tabloids. We'll come on to, briefly, Rupert Murdoch's announcements about putting paywalls up around newspapers in a little while. I was briefly News International Professor of Media at another university. There's nothing to say about that, I just was. They didn't want to hear this argument. They just didn't want to hear anything about this stuff, and they still don't. And that's fine. Jeff Zucker, NBC Universal, one of the biggest names in television, he said, Google was built on the power of math. I think he meant maths. Math and algorithms. I think he's American. NBC is built on brilliant programming. Both are compelling models, but I don't think Google's model is as powerful as Viacom, blah, blah, and as the market would have you believe. There's one minor problem with that. It's total nonsense. It's trying to compare apples with oranges. It's like saying, oh, well, actually, the water companies who distribute water, which is a necessity of life, have a different model to NBC, but NBC is better. At what? It's not the same thing. That's not to say there is no value in NBC. If you watch 30 Rock, or you watch a number of the other things that come out of NBC, you know that they create incredible television from time to time. But to compare it against Google is to take the wrong place. It's to take the wrong point in the argument and then just get it completely wrong. It just doesn't work, that argument, because Google doesn't do what television does. And there's a lot of this around at the moment, unnecessarily urgent in my view, quite often, what the theorists call last gasp theory. Just as the technology is reaching its end, it turns out to be quite good at being what it was good at. Just as everybody is worrying about the death of television, some people focus on making great television, and there's some great television around the place. And there will continue to be great television around the place. It's last gasp theory. Surely much better to focus on doing what you were brilliant at well than trying to do the alternative, which is what, for instance, the music industry did for quite a long time, which is to take your old way of operating and bring it into the new world. For instance, by trying to reintroduce scarcity. Once music got free, once we could just download music, once it became something that was on the network, you were never going to win by trying to reintroduce the idea that you would put digital rights management, DRM, onto music, and it would be very, very hard to download that, because you were up against something for which it was not very, very hard to download. And before you know it, it takes a technologist in Steve Jobs at Apple to bang the music industry's heads and get them to remove DRM, get them to remove that only plays on your iPod, can only be transferred to a CD by somebody who's got a PhD in law to read the thing that comes with it, that is the click legals and all that other stuff. That's not going with the direction of consumer travel. That was trying to reintroduce scarcity. Reintroduce scarcity around a product where the value was no longer in the physical distribution of a DVD or a CD. It's somewhere else, and we'll come back to where. And we've got somebody doing it at the moment. Mr. Murdoch's touching belief, I shouldn't say, that's terribly rude, isn't it, in the value of his product. I buy it for movies. I buy it for high-value content, financial content. Briefly, I buy it for exclusive content, and we'll come back to some of the other categories later. I don't buy it for a picture of Katie Price coming out of a nightclub. That picture will be available wherever shortly. Only if you've got products which, generally speaking, have some aspect of uniqueness around them? Can you put up a wall and ask people to pay around it? People are not going to die in a ditch to pay for the sun if they can get the same content free somewhere else. It's just not going to happen. That doesn't mean he won't try. I don't think it's about paying on the internet, by the way. I think it's about forcing people to buy newspapers for just as long as possible before they stop doing that in large numbers. We'll see if it turns out to be true. As you may tell, I don't share his belief in the value of his products in the digital space. So let's take another intuitive leap. Surely that means I'm saying that all information should be free. Of charge? Don't know. Well, define free is the first question. I do believe there shouldn't be artificial barriers put up around getting hold of content. That doesn't mean it has to be free. That doesn't mean it has to generate no value. Define free. Do you mean free speech? I do. It should be free, it should be freely available and accessible. But I don't mean free beer. Free beer would lead to the collapse of the Western civilization as we know it. It would also lead to the collapse of industries like brewing and the hospitality industry and bottling and all sorts of other industries. Free speech is very different from free beer. And the enemies of this, the proponents of simplicity, rather, in this debate, like to pretend they're the same. The idea that content should be readily accessible, easily available, is not the same as the idea that it should never be charged for, or that it should never have any value attached to it. I used to be a board member of Creative Commons, the rights organisation. I'm a lawyer by background. Those sorts of simplistic arguments just aren't helping. What's the best thing we could do to copyright, for instance? The best thing we could do to copyright is flip the model from saying all rights reserved, so that if you're a user, if you're a documentary maker in this school, you have to go and ask permission from all kinds of people to show things, is to flip the model from all rights reserved, which was fine when it was a few big companies talking to each other, to some rights reserved, everything else is fine. So to say what you can do with content, rather than just say you can't do anything unless you ask my permission. If you're managing a 3-year-old like that, you would have a very, very busy day. If you took literally every decision on the face of it, and that 3-year-old never learned to chunk information to allow decisions of their own, you would have one almightily bad life. That's where copyright is. It's in a dysfunctional situation where the costs of getting hold of copyright are too high and are standing in the face of what's happening on digital networks. And what happens when these circumstances arise? People simply root round it, and they do what they were going to do anyway. Surely something better that can track the value, that can track the way copyright moves, is the way we've got to go. This whole free debate, in fact, is absolutely full of these false oppositions. There's a book called Free, is it called Free, by Chris Anderson? Something like that, which sort of takes you through these ideas that, you know, free is the new whatever the catchphrase was, but this idea that free is a radical price, I think, is the catchphrase. Well, maybe it is, and we'll come back to some other thoughts in a moment. But it's not an opposition. The content industries have been giving stuff away free for decades for their own reasons. There was a whole channel called MTV, there still is, a whole family of channels called MTV, which built rather a successful business model on the promotional content of another industry, the music industry. There was there still is, just about, an organisation in the US that produced a magazine called TV Guide, which was nothing more than a listings magazine, but in a country the size of the US, that was quite a big deal. I'm reliably informed that there was at least one year in which the profits of TV Guide were greater than the profits of all the American television networks combined. And yet they were giving away free information. False oppositions, oversimplicity. What they mask is an argument about what we value and who's in charge, who controls it. And this is where the shift is happening. But again, let's not oversimplify. There is a shift going on between distribution and discovery, between being able to push content out and helping people find it. If Google, as somebody said, is a database of the world's unfulfilled desires, which I quite like, you type it in and Google helps you find it. Imperfectly, but better, the least worst option. As a colleague of mine, Ashley Highfield, once said, I don't really want to watch a movie on a tiny, tiny 6-inch screen that's moving around like this while I'm trying to watch it. But if the alternative is staring out the window on an aeroplane for 8 hours, it's the least worst thing I've got in front of me. Google's the least worst search engine. If power is shifting from distribution to discovery, that's a big deal. But the theorists and the information fundamentalists will say at that point, so that's it. The old model of distribution is dead. So don't write distribution off just yet. My colleague at the back Rob Morgan, did a bit of research for me. Thank you, Rob. We have charted the revenues of, red is total UK television advertising, 2004-2008. Blue is the UK revenues of Google. Now, on one model, that says, oh my God, be very afraid. Look how big Google is and look how quickly it's going. And that is good and an important thing to think about. But television executives are absolutely terrified that Google is eating their lunch. That red number is staying surprisingly solid at the top. Now, that doesn't mean it will continue to stay surprisingly solid, but it's another sort of Jeff Zuckerism. The revenue out of UK television advertising is about £3 and a bit billion a year. And Google, admittedly, is rising very quickly to over a couple of billion in the UK, which is quite big, but it's actually not killing distribution yet. The more subtle story is that what's happening in television advertising is the value of it is moving into different slots in different parts of the schedule. So they're predicting, I don't know if it'll be true, that the ad slots in the final episode or the final sing-off of The X Factor will be £250,000 each. I've no idea how big that is compared to 10 years ago, but my hunch is much bigger than it would have been for most things. But at the same time, there are television channels in the UK where we have a massive oversupply of television channels in general, which can't fill their slots. So what you're seeing is not total destruction of one by the other. You're seeing a reallocation going on inside these two massive and important markets. And that's because when big media, when it helps you find attention and deliver mass audiences, it's getting more valuable. But at the same time, tailored search-type advertising is of greater value and greater significance to audiences and users than it ever has been previously. The money's coming from somewhere, but it doesn't yet look like it's coming out of television. So when you hear that dichotomy, it might just turn out to be false. So finally, to sort of wrap up, broadly speaking, how do we react to this as individuals? Well, the kind of jargon of this would be, how do we find value? How do we decide what to pay attention to? So I said, I paraphrased the title of this slide as Finding Value, or How Real People Pay with Attention. I think of adverts and television programs as an attention tax. I've turned up to watch a television program, and now you're going to make me watch 2.5 minutes of adverts for the privilege. I flip through them with a PVR. I get them in another form. I get content in another form on DVD or on online. I watch the last ad in break more than I ever did, which, by the way, is usually a promotion for the television broadcaster, because that's the one I know to press play on. So paradoxically, the last ad in a television break is getting more valuable, not less, as more of a skip ads. Anybody noticed how much more vibrant ads are getting to catch your attention, how they're using comedy, how their ads are changing around us to start catching attention back again, trapping attention back again. But they're not just taxing it because we're only there. I'm not sure they ever were. Otherwise, what about all those potentially apocryphal stories about how the National Grid always had to cope with when everybody turned their kettles on in the advertising break on Coronation Street? If we were all engrossed in Coronation Street, who was turning the kettles on? So I'm not entirely sure it was ever different, actually, but I think the difference is being exacerbated and scaled. So where do we find value? Well, here's a few thoughts. A lot of these, by the way, some of these are kind of drawn from the work of somebody called Kevin Kelly, who's the founding editor of Wired magazine, who has, he calls them generatives, these sorts of ideas. He has more of them because he's cleverer. Although it could be that famous phrase that, sorry, I wrote you such a long letter, I didn't have time to write you a short one. Kevin Kelly throws out, you know, as these theorists do, lots of stuff. But anyway, first one, if something is novel, if it's new, first night of something, it's fascinating to watch as kids from the digital media and on-demand universe get used to the fact that there just won't be Doctor Who until Saturday next week. And that's the way it is. Not sure that's a good thing, but it ascribes a certain kind of value for as long as you can hang on to that scarcity. I think that's going to collapse quite quickly. I think what will happen is people will start paying more to be given things earlier. Or it's about now. If a plane hits the towers, if a bomb goes off in central London, the value is now. The value is immediate and knowledgeable information which you trust. If it's a football match, unless you are really very obsessed indeed, you're probably not watching those goals back the following morning. The half-life of match of the day for me is around about 6 or 8 hours before I inadvertently find out what's happened when I'm trying to do it like that. We live in fear in my house of finding anything out about the X Factor or Strictly Come Dancing on the grounds that we've got tiny children. We can't watch television at 6 and 7 o'clock on a Saturday night. So we don't listen to radio, we don't pick up newspapers. we should get out more. Sorry about that. But whichever way that goes, the truth of it is we don't want to find out because it would spoil the experience to some extent. Actually, this year it doesn't because we're not bothered about either of them, who wins, to be honest now. But that's just this year. But there is something about, you know, novelty and timeliness. There's something about personal content, something which is deeply relevant to you. You might pay. You probably will give it more attention. If it's personalised, maybe, I don't know. We just got given a terrible christening gift for our son, a CD. They obviously haven't met us, this particular part of the family. A CD of nursery rhymes with his name in them. So I don't know if it's Jack and Tom went up the hill. I have no idea how they do it because I've not dared to listen, to be completely honest. But there's something in there about personalising it, isn't there? I don't know. There's something in there about making it personal to me. On the web, of course there is. Amazon recommendations, Spotify playlists. That's about personal. That's about something that I would value. I'll pay for that. Might not pay very much, but I will pay something for it. I want truthfulness. I want authenticity. I want what they used to call quality. Something like in my life, I'm a broadcasting regulator. We're not allowed to say quality because that's a value-laden term, and that's correct. But I do want truth. I do want authenticity. And I'll pay for those in some way, whether it's to watch ads. But there is value there for me, which I would ascribe to those. And sometimes I'm really grateful. I know people who paid for the Radiohead album just because they thought it was the right thing to do. There's a deep human psychology that says, I want to pay tribute to these people. I'm going to bow before them, and sometimes you'll do that with money. Sometimes. Not for most bands, not most of the time. But sometimes you'll be grateful and you'll say you're grateful for something. Actually, I think that works much more in the real life economy than it ever will in the economy of media and content. I don't understand thank you cards. They've said thank you. Why have they sent me a card as well? It's an irrational act. I love getting them, though. Something that happens in the real world, this is the big one, something that crosses over between bits and bricks. I will absolutely pay because I have no choice and because I can see the value to go to the gig. I will pay to have the once-in-a-lifetime experience, the thing you can't buy. I will pay to go to the live match, to have the live experience. I will pay to have the live theatrical experience. There are things which are real, there are things which are unique, there are things which can't be copied, there are things which only money can buy. And that real connection into my life that adds value of its learning. It's fascinating, isn't it, that the books appear to remain constant in their prices, but now we have a book tour circuit where writers turn up and hundreds of people pay money to hear them speak and to ask them questions. That's a book. Is it promotional? Yes, they probably sell a few books, but actually I know, because a friend of mine does this, she backs about £5,000 a night from it as well. There's a living in that for some people, some of the time. So the connection between the real world and the virtual is usually left way too late in debates about this territory. What is it not? Well, I don't know if this is, I'm about to get sacked or something, but it's not about commissioning content. You'll have heard this from commissioners who've given presentations, I'm sure. It's not about commissioning content for 360-degree anything. It's about integrated ideas that work across multiple platforms. Anybody who says 360-degree commissioning to you is dad dancing. They're trying to pretend they're in this world, but in fact they're bringing their old idea in, and they should basically have stayed sitting down. It isn't about commissioning new content in a slightly different way, but really television with knobs on, or really a newspaper with some webby bits, because that's not how you consume it. If it's an existing brand that works in that world, I've worked on a number of them, Top Gear and Doctor Who and these sorts of things, then you've already got a centre of gravity in a particular medium, so of course you work like that. But that's not how you start nowadays. It just isn't how that starts. And it really doesn't help in the thinking, because it sort of implies that as long as you have a bit of everything, it'll be fine. And usually, from my experience, creating good interactive media work is about what you leave out, in the same way as making a great film is about what you leave out, in the same way as writing an essay is about what you leave out. So what are my tips for thinking about this sort of stuff? Well, where do you come to it from is very important. There's a brilliant book called Designing Interactions by a guy called Mogridge. It's essentially a set of interviews with the creators of interactive media. One of the things they all share is they have a participant perspective. They think of it as being something I do as a user, not as something that is done to me by a piece of media. Participant perspective, really important. They're clear-eyed about platforms. They're pragmatic about platforms. Only ever do a project on a particular platform if you are being paid an eye-watering sum of money to do it on that platform by somebody, unless it works. I've done projects, loads in my career now, of trying to make content work on certain platforms. If it's not going to work, it's not going to work. I've got a sort of a routine here from my theatre days. I used to show some of you will have seen it. I used to show an opening DVD of 2 clips from the last Shakespeare play I directed, Romeo and Juliet, not my production. One, a very old BBC production, which was a camera slowly tracking back on these dead bodies on a stage, all very black and dark, and this pretentious sort of BBC Shakespeare voice saying 2 households, both alike in dignity, and you could hear the seats slamming up in Scarborough, really. And the other was Baz Luhrmann's film, the opening of Baz Luhrmann's film. One of those is a film, the other is a recording of a Shakespeare play. One of those understands its medium, one of them doesn't. Being pragmatic and clear-eyed about which medium you use is central to creating anything that's going to span platforms. You won't do that if you've got this 360-degree vision. You just can't do that and pay attention to the real value of the platform. Noticeability, you've got to be found. You've got to understand how search engines work at the moment. You've got to understand how viral marketing works. You've got to understand how word of mouth works, because they will be the forces which help your work to rise or fall very, very quickly. And the life cycles of media work now are so short. Massive brands last long periods of time. But how long does Susan Boyle last in this country? An enormous flare. 100 million, 300 million YouTube views, and occasionally now in the paper. She might come back, I don't know. Might be being very well managed, but she'd flare and then go away for a period of time. Noticeability, very, very important, but it's not as important as permanence, because, or at least longevity. Because from longevity comes noticeability. The longer you're about, the more people trip over you. The more search engines find you, the more people discover what you're about. And so you've got to be around for a little while. Not least because most of the very noticeable, pragmatic propositions out there that are based on the participant's perspective are actually communities. They're social networks, or they're fan groups, or they are they're organizations of people loosely gathered around a content organization or a brand. They're communities, not audiences. And communities take time to build. And that's how long you need, enough time. Of course, you never know what enough is, but it is always more than the television or print media cycle. Multi-platform projects, cross-platform projects, interactive projects take time to build. Big games titles have a lifespan of a year or more. They take 40 hours to play, some of the big ones. Television commissioners dream of 40 hours spent with a program. Many of them dream of 40 hours spent with a channel. It's an enormously distinct, it's a very distinct space to be in. And the other thing you mustn't do, and this is the sort of closing sequence now, is you mustn't go too far. You can go too far in these ways and many others. You can believe too much in what they call the wisdom of crowds. There's a great book called The Wisdom of Crowds, another book called Here Comes Everybody by Clay Shirky. They're very interesting. It's all about the rise of what we call bottom-up mass participation media. But you can take it too far, because the wisdom of crowds can quite rapidly become the madness of the mob. There's something very complex about the way markets and democracy work and the way that they condition themselves. Something I suspect an incoming Tory government, if there is one, is going to learn. An interesting balance between preserving things, conservatism at one level, and the rise of free market in the media age in another. Because many of the things that one hand wants to preserve are likely to get decimated by choices of mass audiences pulling together their views of what they want. That's been a plaintive cry, because it's art versus utility, the second point. That's been a plaintive cry forever. It's an elitist cry. And I make no bones about that, and I make no apology for it. Because I don't believe the crowds would have created Mozart's Great Mass in C minor. I also don't believe the crowds could have painted a Van Gogh. I don't believe the crowds can write Shakespeare. I do believe, however, they can tell me about things that they want. They can critique and give me information that is helpful to me as a creator. They can destroy and or make me with the things that they do and choose to do with their time. But they're not necessarily going to have the spark. The crowds don't have sparks in that way. So you can overbelieve in the wisdom of crowds. You can forget that this argument has been around forever, the art versus utility argument. Read a bit of John Stuart Mill, have a look at Wittgenstein's aesthetics. These arguments have been around for a long time, and they will remain around us until we have sentient computers and all the other things from science fiction. And hopefully I am a disembodied head in a Matt Groening cartoon. We We also need to remember that markets can undermine what we call quality. This is a kind of plea for understanding the need to manage markets. I'm not going to use the word regulate in this context, but to manage them in some shape or form. We manage them with old-fashioned tools some of the time. Tools we use in news, for instance, around balance, impartiality. We manage them using economics by asking for consideration to be given to the dominance of a player in a particular market, whether it's telecoms or whether it's sports rights or something. But actually we shouldn't get too dogmatic, because markets will find their level. And often that will drive innovation, but not always, and not unregulated and unstructured. We aren't hearing a debate about this really at the moment, thankfully, in the media. Maybe we'll hear it shortly. We aren't hearing it enough, I suspect, in the financial services industry for my liking. We also need to get rid of the wishful thinking. Local newspapers. Does anybody actually believe that local newspapers held local democracy to account at any time in the last 50 years? Because I don't. I believe they printed press releases and they're very valuable for all sorts of other things, but I think they may have been out there contributing to the amount of information. They may be very valuable to the primary school, but I'm not sure they were holding news to account. They were holding power to account, which I think is one of their primary functions. And if they weren't doing that, let's not put in place a solution now, which we're talking about in policy circles at Ofcom and elsewhere, to save newspapers. Let's put in place the answer to the problem, which is holding power to account, understanding how to make democracy work. And if newspapers are part of that, great. If they're not, thank you very much. Good night, Vienna. But it's not about protecting those institutions. They don't have a monopoly on the core idea. And many of them actually haven't been fulfilling that core idea for a long time. It is sacrilege for me to say it. This is not official Ofcom position, but I would apply the same logic to television local news. It needs some serious work on what it's for, not just on how it's funded. And that brings us finally to the last sort of set of wishful thinking. Regulation, safety. I'm writing a book at the moment with Professor Tanya Byron, who did a government review last year on internet safety. She, I think, brought a sort of level-headed calm to the debate about what needs to happen with social networks, what should happen with computer games and our children, not least because she said it was partly about safety and it was partly about digital literacy. If my overriding theme has been anything tonight, it's been about empowerment of us as individual users. That means we have to understand and accept that sometimes there are people out there who need protection. It would interest you to know, maybe you already know, that the number of complaints to Ofcom and the Press Complaints Commission are higher this year than any year on record, and they were last year, and they were the year before. People aren't ready for the new world necessarily of being able to look after themselves. Children and the vulnerable need to be thought about and protected in some shape or form. But actually that doesn't mean putting red ropes outside everything and saying, do not go here. There need to be spaces for risk. There need to be sensible approaches to this stuff. We need to think about it as a form of literacy. We, as participants in this big ecosystem, just as we do in the green ecosystem, need to think about the implications of what we do and what might happen as a result. Because in the end, we are heading towards empowerment. The general direction of travel is to shift the locus of control towards us, the people formerly known as the audience, because it's our attention that has to do the paying. And as long as our attention has to do the paying, we will be, to some extent, in the driving seat. And that is the end of the lecture. Thank you very much.
I'm going to let Anthony take us to the board there and we'll do some questions. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Steve Jukes, I'm the Dean of the Media School, and I'm a friend of the school and has done amazing things for us. One thing struck a chord with me when he said that we would never quote a lecture which would combine Wittgenstein, Proust and Jedwood, so I think that was true. I'll start with one question. You talked about the move from scarcity to ubiquitousness, whatever the noun is on ubiquitous. What's the dynamic of that? Is the scarce content static, scarcer, or is everybody cottoning onto that and therefore it's getting bigger? And is the amount of ubiquitous content, that junk out there, is that growing exponentially? What's the relationship between the two?
Well, I think one person's junk is another person's car boot sale. So finding value is something that is done by an individual person at an individual level. So it's junk to me to go and look at a forum about classic cars, but it's not junk to a very great friend of mine. So one of the things I think is happening is that our kind of values systems about how or if we bother defining good from bad are changing. I think what makes the one way of describing it is the content that has a very high signal to noise ratio that sticks out. And that sticks out, I think, for the same reasons it always did. It's good, it's of high quality, it's well made, it's thoughtful, but actually increasingly it's about how open it is to interactivity. So for me, it's the question pivots on how much I, as a member of the audience or the people formerly known as the audience, can sort of adopt content and take it to be my own. I would have always done that by talking about it down the pub. But for me now, I want to talk about it wherever I want to talk about it. So there's less, specific answer to the question, I think there's less content that cuts through in a given country, but there are larger projects and larger content propositions that cut through globally. Formats, big sports rights, that kind of thing. And there's masses more stuff out there, but it's of value to small niches. And the niches are really small. You can make money on a few thousand people if they're really passionate about the thing that they're a niche in. So the values are shifting around.
We have a roving mic, so some questions from the audience, please. Who are the mic?
It's over there.
Questions from you. It was a reference to proof.
We've got some in the middle.
One over here. Speak loudly. Well,
I think we're recording, actually, if you don't mind.
Hi, yeah. I wonder if you're actually being a bit hard on Murdoch, and maybe he's playing a smarter game than we give him credit for. And I think part of his strategy is that he's saying, I'm trying to charge for this content and I can't make any money out of it because the BBC is giving it away for free. And so actually it's a kind of tactic to try and get rid of the BBC News website.
I feel there's some truth in it. I'm deliberately being hard on Murdoch. It's a lecture, isn't it? Yeah, I think there's definitely some truth in that. I think there's also truth in the idea that kind of in the old world of physical distribution, enough newspapers doing something would have inflected the newspaper market. But it's way bigger than the newspaper market. I think it's also kind of interesting that it's sort of smoked Google out slightly to start saying, well, we share content, we share revenues, that's not really understood enough in the debate, actually, I think. I think where it's sort of Canutian is the idea that you just put the price on and everything and people will start paying. I mean, there are lots of examples of people who have tried that and generally it utterly decimates their traffic. So if he's got a problem funding now, I don't think it's going to get vastly better. And by the way, he does have a genuine problem. News organisations have a massive, genuine problem with funding what they're doing. I worked with The Guardian for years. It's shelling money out the door. Somebody in the middle a moment ago. There's another one there.
I'm wondering if you have like any comments on the recent Google Books settlement with the orphan copyright thing.
With the out of copyright stuff, or the in copyright?
They made available like millions of orphan books whose copyright holders are not found. So
well, I mean, temperamentally, I'm inclined to believe it's a good thing for them to have done, and I can understand the complex dynamics of why they're doing it. Drives more search to Google. And there's an interesting thing about UK copyright law and what happens to an orphaned work, a work where nobody knows who really owns it. So they sort of sit on the shelf as opposed to what might happen soon. They'll just be able to be released sort of public domain. So I'm kind of in favour of opening the public domain up as much as possible and getting it online and digitised. But I'm not sure that's the same as some of the more extreme sort of positions that some of the search engines take about digitising sort of books in print and books already in copyright. I think that's a commercial problem. I don't think that's a legal problem at all. I think it's about working out who's going to pay who what. And as soon as they do that, I think they'll be fine. I think, in fact, lots of this is about the balance between how much money the search guys make and how much money the content guys make. And most of it is posturing still. And that's true of books. It's absolutely true of YouTube. Susan Ball not going on YouTube was heavily about an argument between who got the money. It wasn't a point of principle about who owned the copyright. It was an argument about who got what share. I think the same is true of Google Books going forwards into the copyright space. I do a little dance.
Given what you were saying about the importance of literacy and free speech and the production of the kind of regulatory environments that will facilitate that sort of thing, what are your views on the proposals that the government are putting forward, such as 3 strikes and you're disconnected?
I think there's a grain of interestingness in them, in the sense that I'm fairly confident, and I've seen research suggesting that 1 strike will deter a very large number of people from doing anything, but it won't fix the sort of hardcore question about piracy. I don't believe it will. I think there is then a genuine problem about the idea. The thing I have the most discomfort with it, whether it's 3 strikes, whatever period it is that I don't think these are administrative decisions to be made by politicians. I think there absolutely have to be proper legal processes involved in anything that involves the suspension of what I think is basically a primary service. Whether it's a human right is something for the courts to determine, but you don't suspend people's water like that, you don't suspend people's electric like that. So I think the thing that discomforted me most about the initial proposals was, as I saw them, was that they were essentially riding roughshod over that kind of protection. And I saw lots of early drafts of them for reasons to do with Ofcom things. And they veered from being worse than that than better than that all over the place. And I think there's a value in something being done, but I think we've got to be very careful about effectively allowing the content industries to become the police on this one. I don't think that's helpful to anybody, including them, actually. I think the idea of suspension terrifies them. The interesting sub-story, which did come out in a bit of the press, was that the security services are absolutely terrified of the entire thing because they believe it will ratchet up encryption. They believe that it will drive a market for encryption technology in this country so that the really bad people out there are unfindable. And there's something in that, something deeply terrifying about that. If we're protecting the record industry at that kind of cost, I think we've got to talk to the record industry about it. There was somebody there, there's people at the back. This is the worst bit. This is much worse than giving a lecture.
Anthony, that was a great lecture. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
that. I'm just interested to know, you've talked about too much stuff being out there.
Yeah.
Do you think there's still a place for people to mediate between the person and the stuff?
Yeah, totally. Absolutely do. There's a book called The Paradox of Choice, which sort of goes into that territory. Sorry, I do sound like a bibliography tonight, but I'm trying to be a professor a bit. Yeah, absolutely do. I think that's what happens at the social group level anyway. That's what we do for each other as social groups. I think and the more you have trust and the more you believe in the authenticity of the person's voice, whether it's because you know them because they're related to you or a close friend or whatever it is, or because you feel you have that kind of projection onto them because they're a star name or celebrity or an academic or whatever it is. I think the value of that capability to act as a filter is rising, absolutely rising. And we see that to some extent in a kind of slightly dishevelled sort of way in the blogosphere. Some blogs rise because people are active at them, but also because they're expert, and those expert voices may not have been heard before. Now, I'm not suddenly suggesting that that's the death of, that's the rise of a fifth estate or the death of the press as we know it, but there's something in there about authenticity. You find it actually, paradoxically, I found it most in my professional career working with the utterly uncontroversial figure of Jeremy Clarkson, because those who believe Jeremy and believe in his views on cars really believe Jeremy and his views on cars. And they search for him like mad on Google. And whatever you think about him, what you learn from that is that that is a signal in a noisy environment and that people gather around that signal. So I think, if anything, that capability rises more than ever. I mean, who the hell's Simon Cowell 10 years ago? Why am I obsessing with Simon Cowell this evening? But, it's that filtering capability. And there is talent in that. There is incredible talent in that. There really is.
I'm not a media person, and I'm very conscious of your admonition on the screen at the moment about subsequent lectures. It does seem to me that there's a tiny, tiny pachyderm just tucked over there in the corner at an inaugural lecture which seemed to me to be absolutely splendid lecture, and treated a whole set of issues which are particularly relevant to education. I don't think you used the word education once.
No.
You did have a slide which said it's not the content, it's the experience. And I wonder if you have any views about virtual learning environments.
Yeah, the PLC I'm involved with is in that space. I very deliberately didn't talk about it this evening, but I didn't use the word education because I prefer the word learning, because I think it's focused on the right part of the chain. So for me, the complexities in the education space, and I do a fair bit of work there, but I didn't cover it tonight, as you say, maybe next time, are all about empowering learners whilst at the same time accepting and acknowledging that there's going to be a change in the role of teachers. There is already a change in the role of teachers, but that does not mean the abolition of teachers. In the same way that there need to be changes in the way we relate the physical institution of a university or a school to the learner. Magic doesn't exist as a physical institution anymore. We disbanded the company physical presence. We get together now where we need to get together as teams and groups, and everything else happens on the move or virtually or however it can happen. To do that, you need to go to a certain place, and actually we find we like to see each other more than we do. But if you take that logic to the learning environment, you know, what are you actually saying? It's about relationships and connections between people. But there's something about trust, there's something about wisdom, there's something about experience in there. I think it's about mentoring. I think it's about supporting. But I can't talk about the future of learning with Professor Heppel in the room. I mean, it's just not the right thing to do. You know, you don't hire a dog and then bark. He's gone now, I can say that. Hi.
What value do you place on information these days? You know, data is so readily available. Do we still value it the same as we did, do you think? The amount of conversations I've had recently in the pub, and everyone will get out their iPhone and Google what someone said because they don't believe them.
There's something really fascinating in there, and it sort of comes to this thing about learning as well. You know, the kind of hidden message about learning at the front of the lecture was, I can get the quote from Proust from Wikipedia. Do I need to know the date of the Battle of Hastings? No, but I do need to know why I need to know the date of the Battle of Hastings. And there's something in there about whether it's about factual data. It's back to data and knowledge and wisdom and information again. Factual data I think you can find, but being a digital literate citizen, knowing what you need to search for, is about being a literate citizen and about being an educated citizen. And my worries are not in find and retrieve information. You know, winning pub quizzes, there's a great sequence in The Office, isn't there, about how one of the characters is brilliant at pub quizzes. He reads a book a week, and they're all pub quiz books. So there's something in there about, you know, winning pub quizzes is not necessarily going to help the world. It will, of course, be able to describe precisely all the things that went wrong as we let the world burn, but it won't help particularly. So there's a sort of thing in there about, you know, how we rebalance that notion. I think it's going to be fascinating watching the Tories struggle with it, because I think they're split if they come in. I think Labour's been split on it. Split between, back to education, but split between standards, learning, split between these ideas that are about measuring things you can measure. My worry is that if you count that much, you end up counting only the things you know how to count. You count things that are countable. And the alternative, which is finding the value in it. So for me, I don't think there was ever any value in data. But there is enormous value in knowing how to apply it, in knowing how to filter it. Back to the previous question, actually, previous question but one. How to filter it, how to find it, how to package it up in meaningful ways. And that, in a strange sort of way, that's why I'm not in this sort of conscious computers, semantic web sort of thing. I know it will occur and it will become more like that as time goes on. But I still think, you know, there's more goes on in here. I really believe in people at the end of the day.
Hi, okay, so seeing as there's so much stuff out there, I'm assuming most things have already been done. You know, trying to come up with original things is very difficult. So where is there really room for innovation? Is it in coming up with new products and new things, or is it in just representing existing products? Or is it a bit of both? You know, where can you actually work towards?
I'm sure the easy answer is it's in a bit of both. Well, for a start, I'm never too sure about innovation as a word for its own sake. That just means new, and new isn't necessarily good. But I think that there's an incredible skill in repackaging. What's that? Somebody's going to tell me now. Which poet is it that says, is it Dali or somebody, great poets plagiarize, no, good poets plagiarize, great poets steal, or something? Is that a quote? Somebody's going to find it. Somebody Google it. But there's something in there about how, you know, how repackaging things that previously existed. You know, that's the one I'm going for, yeah. You know, and so, you know, Romeo and Juliet is based on a Renaissance poem or play or whatever it is, and there's that sort of thing about the artistic equivalent of that Newton quote, "We see further because I stand on the shoulders of giants," or whatever it is. There's something in that which, of course, is always going to be true, but there's also something about genuine sparks of just unimaginable genius, which we mustn't sort of flatten out by de-risking everything, by believing that it is just about having lots and lots of data information. Thankfully, I don't believe we ever could, because I don't believe humankind will ever do that. But I'm back to Mozart, I'm back to Bach. You know, you don't get that by computer. You're just never going to get that by computer. I hope. Please, God, we're not going to, well, please, whoever, we're not going to get that by computer. Do you not drink, you people?
Well, I think that's where I was going to go. Because talk of pub quizzes reminds me that it's my duty to invite everybody to a reception in Poole House. And would you please join me for thanking Professor Anthony Lilley?
Thanks, Stephen.